It started with a phone call no one ever wants to receive. A quiet Thursday morning in suburban Illinois turned into a living nightmare when Becky Thompson's sister, Laura, was woken up by the voice of a detective on the other end of the line. "There's been an incident at your sister's house," he said. "You need to come down to the station." She didn't know it then, but Becky was already getting shot 14 times in her own bathroom. Brutal and calculated killing that would shock the entire community and unravel a story that was anything but ordinary. At first glance, it didn't make sense. Becky was a nurse, a devoted mother of two, and known for her kindness, her patience, her way of making everyone around her feel safe. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She didn't have enemies. She was, by all accounts, the last person you'd expect to be the target of such violent rage. But when detectives arrived at the scene of her modest home just outside of Chicago, what they found told a different story. The house was untouched. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle in the main living areas. But in the master bathroom, the scene was chilling. Becky was found lying beside the tub, her body riddled with bullets. The walls were marked with blood spatter. And the precision of the attack, the number of shots, the grouping of the wounds made it clear this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't random. It was personal. The investigation began immediately, and with it came a slow unraveling of a hidden life. Becky had been married to Greg for nearly 15 years. Two neighbors, and even some friends, they seemed like a typical couple, some ups and downs, but nothing unusual. But as investigators began talking to people close to Becky, the cracks in that image deepened. Her best friend Tanya described Greg as cold, controlling, and increasingly jealous in the last few years of the marriage. He never hit her, not that I know of, Tanya said in her first interview with detectives. But it was like he needed to be in charge of every single thing. What she wore, who she talked to, how long she stayed at work. Another friend recalled Becky pulling away in the months leading up to her death. She'd say things like, "I don't feel like myself anymore," or "I'm just trying to get through this." It was like watching her shrink a little more every time we talked. And then there was her career. Becky had recently gone back to school, working toward a nurse practitioner's license. It was something she'd dreamed of for years, a way to provide more for her children and finally invest in herself. But Greg hadn't supported the idea. In fact, he'd argued with her constantly about it. According to multiple friends and coworkers, he felt threatened. He didn't like that she was growing. He didn't like that she had less time for him. That control, quiet, subtle, emotionally suffocating, had started long before Becky enrolled in school. But it had escalated since, and now she was dead. When detectives questioned Greg Thompson the day after Becky's murder, he appeared calm to calm, one officer would later recall. Dressed in a sweatshirt and jeans, Greg sat with his arms crossed, answering each question with just enough detail to appear cooperative, but not enough to offer any real insight. "I was at the store," he said. "Becky was home with the kids. I had no idea anything was wrong until the police called." But that statement, like so many that would follow, didn't quite hold up under scrutiny. Greg said he had left the house around 7:45 a.m. to run errands. But the security cameras at the nearby grocery store showed him pulling into the parking lot at 9:18 a.m., an hour and a half later. When asked to explain the gap, he shrugged. "Maybe I was driving around," he told them. Clearing my head, the detectives immediately flagged the inconsistency. Becky had been shot sometime between 8:15 and 8:45 a.m., according to forensic analysis of blood drying. And the last activity on her phone, which was a message she sent to her sister Laura about a recipe for dinner, that text sent at 8:12, was the last digital fingerprint she ever made. Then came something that, at first, seemed unrelated. A local news tipster contacted the department and pointed out that Greg Thompson had been a contestant on a daytime TV game show just 6 months earlier. The episode had aired nationally. The tip was entirely out of left field. The case had begun making headlines across Illinois and beyond. And some viewers recognized Greg immediately when his photo flashed across their screens during an evening news segment. But what piqued detectives' interest was what Greg had said on that show. In front of a live studio audience, while competing in a trivia challenge, Greg had been asked what he would do with the grand prize money if he won. His answer? It's probably something practical. "I've got a wife and 2 kids to think about. I've been planning a change." It seemed like harmless banter. But to investigators who were now combing through Greg's finances, those words felt loaded. Because shortly after that appearance, Greg took out a life insurance policy on Becky $500,000 worth. He was the sole beneficiary. And even more telling, he had tried to increase the policy just 2 weeks before she died, citing rising health concerns. The timing was suspicious. The motive was beginning to take shape. As detectives followed the financial trail, they discovered Greg's mounting credit card debt over $70,000. He had recently taken a personal loan from a coworker, failed to pay it back, and was facing a potential civil suit. On paper, Greg was drowning. Becky, on the other hand, had been flourishing. Her work schedule was picking up. She'd been offered a new position at a private clinic with higher pay and more flexible hours. According to her best friend Tanya, she had even started looking at apartments. "She told me she wasn't ready to leave yet," Tanya said, "but she was preparing for it." You could tell she had finally made the decision. She was scared, but she was ready. That readiness paired with Greg's financial desperation was an explosive combination. And then came a crucial discovery. Buried in the family's shared computer hard drive was a folder Greg had tried to delete. Browser history showing searches like how to clean up gunshot residue, how to silence a 9mm, and what time of day do neighbors leave for work. When forensic techs recovered the files, they were stunned not only by the content but by the pattern. The searches had been made early in the morning, around 5 a.m., on the day Becky died. One investigator reviewing the evidence later said, "He was literally planning it hour by hour." This wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated, clinical, and then he sat there and acted like it was just another tragic break-in. But there were no signs of forced entry, no valuables missing, no strange fingerprints, just Becky. Shot 14 times, in a room with only one entrance, while her children were still asleep down the hall. As investigators dug deeper into the case, the carefully crafted image Greg Thompson had maintained for years started to come undone. Friends and coworkers, once charmed by his dry wit and dependable presence, were now rethinking everything they thought they knew. And while Greg continued to assert his innocence in interviews calculated and cooperative, the evidence told another story. A story written in the smallest of details. The quiet mistakes of a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. The turning point came when detectives sent Greg's clothing from the day of the murder to the crime lab for a secondary analysis. On first inspection, his jeans and shirt appeared clean, as if they had never come into contact with a violent crime scene. But under forensic light, faint traces of blood spatter were detected on the underside of his sleeve, teeny droplets invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable under luminol. DNA confirmed it belonged to Becky. Greg claimed he had touched her briefly when the police arrived, that he had tried to check her pulse, but officers on the scene had a different recollection. He never went near the body, one responding officer wrote in his report. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, barely looking at her. He looked like he was waiting for something, not reacting to what he'd just found. But the most damning evidence was on what Greg said or did, was what he forgot to cover up. Becky's cell phone had been left charging on her nightstand the morning of the murder. When detectives reviewed her recent messages, they found a string of text conversations with her sister, her best friend, and a coworker. She had been planning to meet someone that weekend, possibly a divorce attorney. But then they noticed something strange. A deletion. Her last conversation with Tanya had a gap. The system logs showed a message had been sent from Becky's phone at 8:17 a.m., just 5 minutes after her confirmed time of death. The message was simple, almost robotic. "Running late. Call you later?" But it didn't match her usual tone. Tanya later testified it wasn't her voice. Becky never texted like that. Even if she was rushing, she would have added a heart or a little emoji. It felt cold. Phone records confirmed what police feared. The message had been sent from inside the house, after Becky was already dead. They theorized that Greg had sent it himself, trying to buy time, delay any suspicion, make it seem like Becky was still alive. But he had overlooked one crucial element: the house's Wi-Fi network. Every device connected to it left a timestamp, a digital footprint. The message had pinged their router at 8:17 a.m., the same minute neighbors, reported, hearing what they thought was a car backfiring or something like popping sounds. It wasn't a car, it was the gun. Even more damning was the discovery of a second phone burner hidden in Greg's workshop behind a loose panel. On it were deleted texts to an unknown number. Many were gone, wiped clean, but one message remained, missed during deletion. It read, "It'll all be over soon. Just keep quiet." Prosecutors would later argue that this phone suggested premeditation and possibly someone else who knew about the murder or was involved in helping Greg plan it. Though the identity of the recipient was never definitively uncovered, the message destroyed Greg's defense that the act had been spontaneous or accidental. And then came the most gut-wrenching moment of the investigation. Greg and Becky's daughter, only 10 years old at the time, had been quietly drawing in her bedroom the morning of the murder. At first, she told authorities she didn't hear anything unusual. But weeks later, in a follow-up interview, she recounted something chilling. "Daddy told me to keep my door closed. He said Mommy needed quiet." She paused. "Then I heard banging, a lot of it." Her testimony, though difficult to present in court due to her age, added an emotional weight that jurors would never forget. The trial began nearly 18 months after Becky Thompson's murder. By that time, the media had latched onto the case, partially due to the brutality of the crime, but also because of the strange coincidence that the accused had once smiled and cracked jokes on national television during a game show appearance. The same man who now sat in a courtroom, facing life in prison, had recently competed for prize money under bright lights, his wife's fate already sealed in his mind. That duality, the charming showman versus the calculating killer, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken. Neighbors, reporters, and complete strangers waited to hear the story unfold. And it didn't take long for the tension to spike. The prosecution started with the basics, the timeline, the lack of forced entry, the position of Becky's body, and the alarming number of gunshot wounds. The medical examiner testified that the shots had been clustered closely together, fired in rapid succession. This wasn't an act of panic. It was controlled, methodical, overkill. Then came the digital evidence. Jurors were shown screenshots of Greg's deleted search history, each phrase more incriminating than the last. How to silence a pistol, best time to kill someone. How long does it take to die from blood loss? And how to wipe a phone without leaving a trace. The prosecutor didn't have to raise their voice. The evidence was loud enough. Becky's friend Tanya took the stand next, recounting the weeks leading up to the murder. She told me she was afraid. She was trying to leave. She was looking at apartments. She said Greg would never let her go. Tanya paused, voice shaking. "I didn't think he meant it literally. What? I thought he'd make her life harder, not end it." The emotional tone deepened when Becky's sister Laura gave her testimony. She spoke through tears about the moment she received the phone call, the hours of not knowing what had happened, and the devastation of learning how many times Becky had been shot. She was cornered. She didn't stand a chance. That wasn't a mistake. That was a decision. The defense, meanwhile, had little to work with. They painted Greg as a loving husband, under stress, someone who had become overwhelmed by financial hardship and marital strain, but had never acted violently before. They claimed the blood evidence on his sleeve could have come from kneeling beside Becky, despite testimony from officers who insisted he never did. They tried to cast doubt on the deleted messages and browser history, suggesting that anyone could have used the shared devices in the home. But none of it stuck. And then the prosecution played the 911 call. Greg's voice cold, unemotional, rehearsed echoed through the courtroom. "I found my wife in the bathroom," he said. "She's not breathing. There's blood. No urgency. No panic. Just the performance of someone trying to appear concerned." A forensic audio expert testified that the calmness in Greg's tone was inconsistent with the average psychological response to discovering a loved one's violent death. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution revealed one final piece of evidence. Something Greg didn't know they had. It was footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera across the street. Time-stamped at 8:19 a.m., moments after Becky's phone had sent its last message. The camera didn't capture Greg's house directly, but it picked up an audio recording of 2 faint gunshots, followed by the low rumble of a voice and the sound of a door slamming. It was subtle, it's barely noticeable. But when enhanced and aligned with Becky's autopsy and phone data, it placed the moment of death squarely within the timeline. Greg claimed he was driving around. It was the nail in the coffin as the final day of the trial began. The courtroom was saturated with tension. Nearly 2 weeks of testimony, exhibits, and emotional unraveling had led to this moment. Jurors sat quietly, eyes fixed on the judge. Family members clutched tissues in their hands. Reporters sat with pens poised, capturing every flicker of expression. The fate of Greg Thompson, husband, father, game show contestant, was now in the hands of 12 strangers. The prosecution delivered its closing statement with the same calm precision that had defined their case from the beginning. No theatrics, no dramatics, just a methodical walkthrough of the evidence. The blood spatter on Greg's sleeve, the fake alibi, the deleted phone history, the last text sent from Becky's phone after she was already dead, and the neighbor's doorbell audio capturing gunshots. The prosecutor paused, then lowered her voice. This wasn't rage. This wasn't impulsive. This was premeditated. He didn't just kill his wife, he covered it up and went grocery shopping like nothing happened. You don't do that unless you're planning to walk away. The defense gave a shorter, more subdued statement. It focused on doubts and the lack of eyewitnesses, on the possibility that someone else could have used the devices in the house, on the suggestion that Greg had been under severe emotional distress. But even as they spoke, their argument felt hollow, lacking the gravity and clarity of the mountain of evidence they were trying to dismantle. And then, just before deliberations began, something unexpected happened. Becky's 10-year-old daughter, with the permission of the judge and her legal guardian, submitted a written statement to be read aloud. The judge, with a heavy sigh, unfolded the letter. It was handwritten in pink ink, decorated with hearts at the bottom. And though the words were simple, their weight was undeniable. My mommy was my best friend, the letter began. She helped me with my homework, made the best pancakes, and always made me feel safe. I miss her every single day. I still wait for her to come home, even though I know she won't. I hope people remember her as a good mom and a kind person. I just want her back. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a firm, unwavering voice. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Gregory Allen Thompson. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Greg didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, expression frozen. For a man who had rehearsed every move, every line, every live, this was the moment he could no longer control. Becky's family embraced. Her sister sobbed into her hands. Her parents held each other in silence. It wasn't closure. Nothing could bring Becky back. But it was accountability. It was justice. At sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. You deprived your children of their mother, he said. You tried to rewrite the narrative, to play the part of the grieving husband. But your performance was paper-thin. And you forgot one thing: truth has a way of surfacing. Greg Thompson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the weeks that followed, Becky's story continued to circulate, not just as another true crime headline, but as a rallying cry for women in controlling relationships, for survivors of emotional abuse, for people who had been made to feel small and voiceless behind closed doors. Becky's co-workers at the hospital set up a scholarship in her name to support single mothers going back to school for nursing. Her best friend Tanya started a support group for women in emotionally abusive relationships. We couldn't save Becky, she said in a local interview, but we can honor her by making sure her story helps someone else leave before it's too late. And in a bittersweet twist, Becky's daughter, now in therapy and surrounded by a loving, extended family, began working on a children's book dedicated to her mother. It's about a superhero mom, she said, who keeps helping people, even from the stars. Thank you for staying with us through this heartbreaking journey. Becky Thompson's story is one that lingers long after the courtroom lights dim. A dedicated nurse, a loving mother, a woman who dared to dream bigger for herself and her children, only to have that stolen in the most unthinkable way. Her life, though cut short, left behind a legacy that now serves as a warning, a lesson, and a symbol of resilience for others walking a similar path in silence. As we close this chapter, we remember Becky not just for the tragedy, but for her strength, her kindness, and the quiet courage she showed in the face of control. Her story reminds us that danger doesn't always wear a mask. It often hides behind the familiar, the routine, and the people we think we know best. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video. Your support helps amplify the voices of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, your feelings, or your own experiences. It matters. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss the stories that need to be told. Every watch, every like, every share makes a difference and helps us continue shining a light on the truths too often buried. We'll see you in the next episode. Till then, stay safe, stay aware, and never stop asking questions.